From LPM,
Louisville Public Media.
Support for LPM podcasts comes from the Eye Care Institute and Butchertown Clinical Trials, where they strive for diversity, equity, and inclusion within their staff, patients, and clinical trial participants. To learn more, visit butchertown.clinic.
I'm Michelle Tyreen Johnson. Welcome to Race Unwrapped, a podcast unwrapping all the ways race affects our world, whether we're thinking about it or not. This season in Race Unwrapped, we unwrap and unpack the language of race, how certain words and phrases carry more than their share of weight. My guest this episode is Derrick White. He's a University of Kentucky professor of history and African American and Africana studies. In this episode, we discuss how the mention of certain events and tragedies can be a shorthand when race is the topic. Two examples are the Juneteenth holiday and the killing of Breonna Taylor. My guest this episode is Professor Derrick White. He is a professor of history and African American and Africana studies at the University of Kentucky. This episode, we're going to be talking about how certain events and names can be a shorthand, so to speak, for how people talk about race.
My name is Derrick White, born and raised in Lexington, and worked my way through academia to somehow be like 5 minutes from my parents. So that's an amazing story.
I know. Sometimes it's like, we're going to go to the next generation, do different things. I'm back.
Exactly.
Oh, I know. I get it. Trust me, I get it. So the use of certain words or events or even names can sort of serve as a shorthand. And two words that came to mind, one is Juneteenth. I feel like Juneteenth has taken on this new thing in our society that's bigger than the thing itself. What do you think about that?
I mean, Juneteenth is an event that has, I think, morphed into a national event, which initially it was very much a regional event. And, you know, growing up here in Kentucky, I don't really recall, you know, in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, a big Juneteenth conversation or celebration. But my brain is a little hazy because of COVID after, you know, a year, so I can't quite remember it.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the things that's really clear about Juneteenth, I think that's happened since 2000 for sure, is that what was a Texas-based celebration, right, that talks about the end of slavery in Texas after the Civil War, which comes, you know, months after the surrender, becomes kind of a shorthand, as you said, for the way that Black folks have celebrated kind of Emancipation Day, right? And Emancipation Day, the concept that Black folks had celebrated their emancipation broadly from slavery is a common holiday that has been that is celebrated at different places and different times all throughout the country. So for many Black communities over, you know, since the mid-19th century, you know, Emancipation Day was January 1st, right? Because January 1st marked the beginning of the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863. But other states and other regions, obviously, the state of Kentucky, for instance, did not fall under the purview of the Emancipation Proclamation. And so Black folks here in this state, my ancestors, continue to work and to continue to be enslaved, well, at least until the end of the Civil War.
Wow.
In the state of Florida, for instance, I used to work in Florida, so I know this a little bit off the top of my head, is that their Emancipation Day is May 20th.
Why May 20th?
So this is the day that the word gets to the state of Florida, right? Because part of what's happening is that they're only that once we see the surrender I think in March, April of 1865, it takes time for, federal troops to enforce the order on the fringes of the Confederacy, right? So in a state like Florida, it takes a while for that to actually come into being till federal troops kind of roll into town and remind folks and announce in the, in the town square that the Civil War is over and that folks who are formerly enslaved are now free. And this is the same story in Juneteenth. And so I think that what happens is that Juneteenth has become, in some ways, a shorthand amongst Black communities over the last probably 2 decades in the Black communities of celebrating Emancipation Day.
Mm-hmm. I even saw it in Wikipedia where it was synonymous, and it's like those are the same days. That's like saying Christmas and Thanksgiving are the same holiday because they're just a few weeks apart.
Yeah, no, it is, and I think that's a very, and I think local communities at one point in time celebrated Emancipation Days based on, their local understanding of emancipation, right? And I think that as we become a national, travel communication has been able to reduce the distances between communities. We in Black communities in some ways have accepted Juneteenth as an effective shorthand. And I think it's important because one of the things about the traditional Emancipation Day that we see that used to be celebrated on January 1st is that, that gets overtaken by New Year's, right? And so, you lose that. And so Black communities have this still invested. If you have night watch service, for instance, you grew up in Black church, right? On New Year's Eve, a lot of the ideas and concepts of Emancipation Day are built into to that service as well. But Juneteenth, I think, is a really, in some ways, it's a great time, right? It's not the 4th of July, right?
Mm-hmm. Which has its own complicated history.
Right. It's not Memorial Day, which Black folks had created in many ways, which was Decoration Day after the Civil War that gets usurped in the 1920s by the federal government. And so Juneteenth becomes a really good space for Black communities to celebrate their emancipation in a way that had not been, is not complicated by the July 4th narrative and has not been superseded by, the federal Memorial Day, which obscured its kind of, African-American origins after the Civil War. And so Juneteenth is like ours, right? Like it's like one of those dates and names and things that we could do. And then you put that in a particular moment, both in the Obama administration having a Black presidency, so he at least acknowledging that Juneteenth is something important, and then in the Trump administration where Black folks are feeling like they need to assert their kind of racial identity in this kind of hostile national politics and political moment, Juneteenth begins to take on a particular meaning. And then I think last year, I think Juneteenth going forward is going to have a new kind of meaning right after the summer of 2020.
See, I was going to ask you that. I was going to ask you that too. Don't you think it means something for white people now, for people who aren't Black now? I mean, like it's literally a holiday, one of our holidays at the place where I work here now.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think that at the University of Kentucky, we announced that we're getting Juneteenth off, and I thought that was so I think part of it is now going to get involved in and ensnared in these broader kind of diversity and inclusion. And many organizations are looking for, dare I say it, easy diversity and inclusion wins and victories. And so Juneteenth for them is like, let's acknowledge this as a holiday and let's go forward.
I jokingly said, and you got to be careful. I'm a former employment attorney, so I of all people am aware of what jokes you have to be careful about making. But I personally think that the proper way for companies to celebrate Juneteenth is to let Black employees celebrate it 3 years ahead of white employees. to to better convey what Juneteenth symbolizes, but alas, that would probably be considered discrimination. So, can't do that.
Yeah, I don't think that is in the legal playbook.
Dead damn Title VII. Well, and so then that leads, since you're a Kentuckian and I'm here in Louisville, that leads to the other sort of, and I hate to put it this way, but you'll feel me on this. Breonna Taylor seems to have taken on that same sort of thing where people sort of spit out. I'm not talking actual activists, right? I'm not talking people who actually and deeply care about what happened to a that young woman, right? Like to a
Mhm.
breathing, loved person who existed, who is now dead. I'm talking about the people who seem to, I mean, particularly celebrities, like they spit out her name as if it's a symbol of something else. It's almost like it's code. What do you think about that? You know what I'm getting at?
Yeah, I do. I think I do. I mean, I think Breonna Taylor is, she has been part of a series of names, right? Like, I think this is the thing that, like, unfortunately, I think what has come to define the last almost decade, really since Trayvon Martin, right, is this series
Yes.
of high-profile, racially infused, as racist and police action against unarmed Black folks, right, and that there are in some ways so many names, right, and this is not to say that they didn't exist before Trayvon Martin. I always have
Absolutely.
to remind
No,
students
no, that's
that
right.
Trayvon Martin represents a technological change. And the
Mm,
technological change is that social media was able to pick up these tragic events and turn them into national conversation in a way that we had only seen a few other times in American history,
right,
right? Like,
right.
I liken it to the ways in which the Black press and Emmett Till's mother, right? Um,
Yes,
like,
yes.
went on a national crusade to bring attention to what the state of Mississippi, these two men, they had done to her son, but also the
Mm-hmm.
state of Mississippi that refused to convict them, right?
Right.
But like that, Emmett Till was a particular moment, but as any historian of America knows that he wasn't the only young person ever
Nope.
lynched, right?
Mm-mm.
Like, and I think that there is a sense that she employed a kind of, I hate to use the word public relations because it seems crass and like she didn't do it, but like she employed the media in a way that drew attention to this particular case. And in the context of the beginnings of the civil rights movement, transformed his death into something more than
Yes.
another lynching in the long lines of thousands of young, African American folks, men, women, children lynched at the hands of white supremacy.
But you know what the
And I'm
irony?
like,
But you know what the irony of that is, though. Like she did that and publicized the death of her son as an object lesson. Using her own personal loss and grief as an object lesson, right? To the point that we all know about it. At least all Black people know about it, and the white people who and the people who aren't Black who care about these things know about it, right? But the irony is that the white woman who basically got Emmett Till killed, who on her deathbed basically said, I made that up, right?
yeah,
That
absolutely.
that she didn't, that even though we have technology above and beyond what we had during Emmett Till's life, that didn't spread as far as Emmett Till's death itself. Don't you think that's ironic?
Yeah, I mean, I think it rather quickly moved away from her as the
Mm-hmm.
woman and to her husband and brother who committed the act, and then the state of Mississippi, which Black folks wanted to condemn as as the most segregated space, and that's a huge debate, because I think that these are differences of order and not of kind.
Ooh, I'm from Kansas and Missouri. You don't have to tell me, because folks love to act like the Deep South is the only racist pedigree in American history. It's like, really, boo boo, really? Anyway, sorry.
Yeah, no, it's like, oh, it's so bad in Mississippi, and I'm like, I'm from Kentucky. I'm like, you should try riding around this state a little bit.
Exactly. Again, going to school in Missouri, it's like, we want to talk racism. Hold my beer.
Exactly. And so I think that, you're right. I think that there is a certain kind of irony that she was able to live her whole life, even as this Emmett Till discussion had become, a national historic conversation. She almost took that secret that she had made it up to her deathbed. And if it wasn't for Timothy Tyson, who was able to secure an interview, and in the course of that interview, get her to admit. And I say this as a Black historian. Tim Tyson is a fantastic, amazing writer and historian. But he's able to accomplish what Black historians we would have never gotten in the room, right? Let alone gotten her to have this conversation, right? And so you talk about, white allies and white folks who are aware of these situations. They play an important role.
Yes, don't they though?
To dislodge these narratives and help us get closer to the truth, right? Because that's the only way we can really operate and move forward historically. But so Emmett Till's a case, and then obviously in my lifetime, Rodney King was the case in which we saw on camera this, traditional beating, and which was horrific. And when I show that to students in class, they can't believe it. First of all, they can't believe how shaky the video is. I was like,
right.
It's like we were living in a different age. But the other part is, that I also remind them, I was like, NWA came out with a song with F the Police. That was like 4 years before Rodney King, right? Like, there is something about the ways in which Black folks was experiencing Black police brutality as part of our understanding of our lived experiences, but also our understanding of our history. I mean, we found out that that Princeton and Penn had remains from the MOVE bombing in Philadelphia, right?
Wow.
Like on their campus, like these are and so folks in activist communities and in East Coast communities in Philly and DC and New York, the MOVE bombing is a very kind of anchor for the way that they understand state violence, right?
Absolutely. That MOVE bombing was something else. And the number of people who probably grown people who don't even know what the MOVE bombing was about. I mean, I remember the MOVE bombing.
Exactly. And it is horrific to think about the kinds of information that we're getting 35, 36 years after the event, that we're just now getting information that these Ivy League institutions were holding on to the remains, or we just found out that the person who's over, the in the city of Philadelphia had supposedly disposed of the bodies and cremated the remains, only to have someone not follow through on the order, and they were able to find it. Like, this is chaos. The fact that we're just having this conversation 30 plus years later speaks to the kinds of absences and silences that Black folks experience when it comes to both police violence and state violence. And so, back to your point about Breonna Taylor as a shorthand, I think it's an important moment, right? Because I think it's an important moment for a couple of reasons. Is that activists have talked about, say, her name, right? That it's been Michael Brown, it's been Trayvon Martin, right? It's been young men who have been murdered by the police, and that the murders of Black women as well as non-binary individuals, right? Like, I think that is their experiences get erased or obscured in this conversation. And so Breonna Taylor is a really interesting moment, I think, historically, that she has now has you know, I think this is the wrong way, but she is now remembered in this broader context as a shorthand for broader police violence in a way that, like, even Sandra Bland, like, doesn't have the same kind of, I think, resonance. And so the question remains,
true.
you know,
That's so true. Like Sandra Bland probably would have been the black woman up until Breonna Taylor, but Breonna Taylor's, the circumstances of hers, I think really like hit home for people because it was such a direct correlation, so to speak.
yes, right. And it was, and, you know, I think Sandra Bland is I think, clear what happened, but also surrounded in mystery. Like, she was in jail and then she ended up dead, and we just don't know how that happened, right? Like,
oh, I know. Sandra Bland, you know, like we probably all as black people have a particular thing that's happened to a black person that we relate to. Like the circumstances are like, that could have been me in a way that maybe other things, you know, you don't have as much of an affinity with. For me, it was Sandra Bland. It's like educated, mouthy black woman who got into it with the police because she knows her rights and then ends up in jail. That was particularly scary for me.
No, I think, and understandably so. But I think what Breonna Taylor, I think her circumstance speaks to the just kind of nakedness of police violence, right? Like a no-knock warrant for no real good reason, and I think the failures of not only policing in the city of Louisville, but nationally, and also the same ways that the Second Amendment people have rarely, I have yet to see them come defend Breonna Taylor and her boyfriend. Like, is a lot of silence around them, right? Like, and you know, so I think that there's a real tragedy that we see, and I think you're right. I think that one of the things that happens is that the lived experience of Breonna Taylor, right? Like her loved ones, her family, her experiences, positive and negative, gets replaced with this terrible event. But at the same time, if it forces us as a society, when we hear her name, to think about the kinds of violence that black women face, that's on par with black men, I think that is a way to keep her memory alive in some form or fashion, and that she just does not go the same way as you know, other black women who have been attacked by the state, and you know, they have a brief moment but are basically forgotten. So I think that's to me, you know, there's no positives in none of this, but I think that's the way that she has the opportunity to go. And I think it's a lot like Emmett Till, right? Like Emmett Till is not the first person to be lynched, right? Like, and I think that, and not the last, right? But I think that he functions as a shorthand to help us understand the nature of white violence in the Deep South, in particular, and in that part of American history.
And I'm so glad that you circled back to that, because I wanted to be clear that when I talk about the language of race this season, to me, it's not about just the negative. You know, like even saying shorthand, one could argue, oh, you're saying reductionist. And I'm like, no. Yeah, some people are being reductionist. You know, some people are doing that. Sort of the way people will say people of color when they mean black people. It's like, did you mean black people?
Yeah.
Right? Like,
yeah,
that sort of thing. No, I'm talking both the positives and the negative. Like, if Juneteenth, for example, as shorthand, allows us access to have discussions about slavery and the impact of slavery and what post-slavery America look like and how we're still dealing with the aftermath of that. I mean, if that is the shorthand route we go, let's take it. Let's get on that road.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a positive, right? I mean, I think there's always risk, right? Like my scholarship is about the civil rights movement in sports and some other areas, but one of my first books was on a black think tank in Atlanta that was formed in the aftermath of King's assassination, the Institute of the Black World, and the IBW was affiliated initially with the Martin Luther King Center. And they had a whole kind of administrative as well as ideological falling out. But one of the things that comes out of that frame that I really got to understand, and what they were saying even as early as 1969, 1970, is that one of the things that the King Center had done is they had framed Martin Luther King as in a particular kind of safe way. And this is and so you see this long road to the King holiday beginning almost immediately after his assassination. And what that required was it meant valorizing the March on Washington and reducing, where do we go from here, right? His last text, right? And so that push to create a King holiday becomes a shorthand for how we've understood the civil rights movement. And so one is that it favors charismatic male leadership at the expense of grassroots leadership that was often female-led and influenced. And two, what it also does is it signals that the civil rights movement is somehow over, right? So King, it's like it's over. So with his death and then ultimately with his holiday, we get to talk about the civil rights movement in the past tense and not in the present tense, right? And this is, that framing in particular led to the Supreme Court gutting the Voting Rights Act, right? That, Chief Justice John Roberts could could use a logic that says that that the mechanisms that the Voting Rights Act protected, right? All these kind of, trickery in terms of trying to reduce Black participation. Well, that's all over, right? We're well past that because the Civil Rights Movement is over. And so by gutting the Voting Rights Act, it unleashed a new wave of voter suppression. And that's part of the kind of, this is not the King Center's fault, but this is one of the unforeseen consequences of framing it in that particular way. And then the last consequence is just the one I find the most annoying, is that everybody gets to invoke King without actually reading King, as if he wasn't a thinking and developing activist and scholar and pastor. And so,
Derrick, you need to quit, because we could go on for another 3 hours about my personal pet peeve of Martin Luther King Jr. as racial Santa Claus.
The junior senator from Kentucky invoked King the other day and we talked about the King, talking about critical race theory, and King wouldn't want the content of the character. And I was like, that means you ain't did the homework, right? Because King was actually talking about, he said that the biggest fear was not the Klansman, but the white moderate, right? He's already giving you a kind of advanced kind of scholarly, what we would actually say critical race theory.
I mean, the number of times I've had to throw a letter from a Birmingham jail at somebody who was trying to do some content and character. It's like you have taken like 1 to 2 lines that make you feel personally, patted on the back, and you done skipped every other damn thing that Dr. King wrote.
They did not even read the March on Washington speech itself, right?
Right, the whole speech.
What normally is called the bounce check. He's like, America has written a check to its Negro population and it has come back with insufficient funds, right? Like that's what it says. And so when you're talking about that kind of analysis, like you invoking King is almost sacrilegious, right? Like at some point,
sacrilegious, yes.
It is so much bad faith in the ways in which it gets articulated, right? And so the fear about using someone like Breonna Taylor's experience, or even Juneteenth, is that that once it leaves kind of Black communities, the ways in which activists and organizers and scholars and communities understand the term and seeps into the broader public, it can be used in bad faith, right? And so Martin Luther King is not really about reading and understanding the depths and the complexities and the changing kind of ideas of Martin Luther King. It becomes about having a Martin Luther King sale at Target, right? And so I think Juneteenth runs the risk of being this thing, right? Because corporations, universities, cities are looking for easy kind of wins that signal that they are supportive of Black communities, and Juneteenth functions as an easy win. Or you can invoke Breonna Taylor's name and it gets invoked in bad faith, right? And so I think that there's a lot of risk involved, and I think that this is any language, right? Anytime we use words and they leave our mouths into the all broader public, or I write certain things, they come out for broader interpretation and use, and you don't control any of that after the fact. But we should be, as thinking parts of communities, we should be aware and really identify the ways in which individuals try to use this in bad faith and hold them accountable. And that's, I think that's part of the frustration on the act of, us among activists and academics, is that there's no media. When Rand Paul invokes King, there's no follow-up question that what about King, who did this, who said he was closer to democratic socialism, right?
Yes.
Is that the King you want, or are you saying that King is I'm confused about how you're invoking this idea, and that requires us having a deeply educated, media on these particular subjects, and really what you get is a lot of just simple questioning that allows for bad faith usage of any of these ideas, whether it's King or Emmett Till or Breonna Taylor or Juneteenth.
Professor Derrick White, that was a perfect way to wrap this up. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate this.
Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.
That was Derrick White, Professor of History and African American and Africana Studies at the University of Kentucky. Next episode, I talked to Professor Steve Bianami about the use of the word articulate. That's right, the word that's a compliment, except when it's not. I'm Michelle Tyreen Johnson. Thank you for listening to Race Unwrapped.
Race Unwrapped is produced by Michelle Tyreen Johnson. Our executive producer is Laura Ellis. Audio assistance from Eric Matthews. And music by Allison Cross. For more information, to contact us, or to support Race Unwrapped, visit wfpl.org/raceunwrapped. From LPM, Louisville Public Media.
Support for LPM podcasts comes from the Eye Care Institute and Butchertown Clinical Trials, where they strive for diversity, equity, and inclusion within their staff, patients, and clinical trial participants. To learn more, visit butchertown.clinic.